I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the lasting changes, the longer term changes that we see facing the industry from the current pandemic, and really the need for the industry to maybe rethink the route to consumer, right? And I think we're facing a major shift in the way the consumer engages the wine industry. And I think Rob and Terry and Armin have all kind of touched on this to some degree. But when you talk about the shifts that have happened, the press has really tended to focus on the numbers coming out of Nielsen and IRI, the measured channels that have shown, great growth and 40% monthly growth rates in some cases, and it gave you the impression that suddenly maybe the whole country started drinking the way my family does, right? And clearly that's not the case, and thank God, because people are still showing up for work. But the fundamental problem is, the fundamental problem is that the current context has shifted consumption away from kind of tasting rooms and on-premise channels towards measured off-premise, which arguably are the least attractive, least interesting channels. And no offense to
Steve.
Yeah.
Steve, sorry to interrupt. There's a clicking sound from your microphone. It's coming through on the stream. I'm focusing on the material. Just see if you can either hold it to something or tie it around a button or put it inside the jacket or something. Put it inside your shirt. Try that.
Okay, let me try holding it up like this. I'm sure that every time I move my hands, it's rubbing against my shirt collar. So let me know. Just flag if it continues to happen. But
okay.
This again. So we've seen consumption shift to what is arguably the least attractive channel, and I don't mean to be offensive to people like Danny Bragg or Recover Nielsen, but brand selection in the measured off premise, the big box retailers, tends to be very limited. Limited access, very difficult for small wineries, nearly impossible to access, and revenue per case and margin per case much lower than an on-premise or independent retail. And this is kind of, again, numbers from Gomberg Fredrickson on the right. And we know this to be intuitively true, right? I mean, the local Safeway doesn't have a great allocation of Chateau Lafite or Screaming Eagle, right? So we know that we've shifted towards the lowest, maybe the lowest average value channel, right? And so social distancing measures have really clearly been devastating for tasting rooms and on-premise. That's really what's been bearing the brunt of it. And when we think about the on-premise, maybe it's less than 20% of industry volumes, but it's an increasingly or an incredibly important source of industry margins. But maybe even as important, it's always been traditionally the channel for brands to engage consumers, right? This is where consumers often experience brands for the first time. So jump to the next slide. This naturally kind of raises the question, when will the industry get back to normal? When can we expect the on-premise channel to return to normal? And on this point, there was really a lot of optimism, let's say back in May, when we started to see the number of new counts of new cases of COVID-19 starting to decline. We saw more on-premise venues starting to reopen around Memorial Day. The unemployment figures kind of started coming down and things started looking much more promising. But unfortunately, I think, the optimism was maybe a little bit premature. The reopenings were followed by a rapid rise in the number of new cases. We've had to kind of start shutting down venues again. And really, the point that I want to draw on all of this is that the longer this lasts, the harder and longer the recovery process is going to be. And, at the start of the shelter in place and social distancing measures that we saw, the Brewers Association, which represents a lot of craft brewers, did a survey of their constituents, many of which are dependent on their brew pubs, and said, how long do you think you can continue to function under the current circumstances, right? Just trying to gauge the outlook, how difficult it's going to be for them to survive the social distancing measures. And 15% of them didn't think they could survive 1 month under those circumstances, and 60% didn't think they could survive 3 months, right? So clearly, the longer this lasts, the more permanent closures we're likely to see in the on-premise. And then even when bars and restaurants are allowed to reopening, the social distancing rules that we're seeing make it really, really problematic for many of them as well, right? Most restaurants run on very thin margins and need to run at least 70% capacity just to break even. So the social distancing measures are going to make it very, very difficult. Jump to the next slide. So kind of between the forced temporary closures, social distancing measures, consumers concerned about contagion, then tack on to that lost volume, lost foot traffic from lost tourism, and people not working from home, people working from home, not socializing after work, etc. The outlook for the on-premise in the medium term is really, really challenging. My colleague Amit Sharma, who works with me here in New York, kind of did an outlook. He covers the on-premise. And for him, even by the end of 2022, we don't see a full recovery in full service restaurants, right? So, and keep in mind, even going, at the end of 2019, this was already a challenging and competitive channel to begin with. And then I would kind of add to that, the loss of some of these venues is going to be tough enough for the wine industry, but important to note, this also has the knock-on effects for small wholesalers who tend to be overexposed to this channel. We recently had Tom Cole, the CEO of RNDC, on our podcast, Liquid Assets. If you haven't checked it out, you might want to. And he was clear as we talked about this issue. He said, this is coming, this context is going to be really, really difficult for a lot of these small wholesalers who kind of depend on the on-premise. A lot of them are going to fold, and he sees that as a real consolidation opportunity for them, right? So it's an opportunity for large wholesalers to consolidate, but for small wineries, this means fewer opportunities, fewer options to access three-tier system, right? And so we think that wineries that are dependent on the on-premise for engaging consumers are really going to need to explore new venues and new ways to engage the consumer. And the obvious question is, where do you do that? Where are those opportunities likely to come from? Damon, if you could jump to the next slide. The obvious answer is e-commerce. And when you look across, these are a number of different platforms or types of platforms, groups of platforms. Really, through this whole pandemic, the growth of e-commerce has been nothing short of spectacular. Tremendous growth across nearly every platform you could look at, and again, from maybe a relatively small base, but even the larger platforms like wine.com and Drizzly seeing sales rise by 250%. Really, this has been better for them than Christmas and New Year's, right? This has really driven driven tremendous growth and interest in e-commerce, and clearly the growth rates at this level are not likely to last. But the interesting thing is the pandemic has really accelerated e-commerce adoption, getting consumers signed up and getting them used to using these platforms. And you can rightly say, okay, that's great, but e-commerce is small. You could rightly point out it's going to be a long time before e-commerce is able to kind of replace all of the on-premise. But really, it isn't necessarily about that. And jump to the next slide. I think we need to think a little bit more broadly and more creatively about e-commerce. And, we often think of e-commerce as just a means of driving direct to consumer sales or a means of driving sales through platforms like wine.com. And that's certainly part of it, but it can be, and it should be, much more. And we recently had Wayne Dwan, the head of e-commerce for Constellation Brands, on our podcast. And if you haven't heard those, you should definitely go back and check those out. Wayne is one of the really smart guys in the room, in just about any room he's going to be in. And we've actually had him on twice for two-part episodes. So he's been kind of a regular guest for us. And he talked about online sales as being kind of the tip of the iceberg, right? Where online sales are a small part of what e-commerce is, but it's maybe the part that's easier to see and easier to measure. But really, we need to think more broadly and more creatively about e-commerce and think about it as more as getting to know the consumer, engaging her wherever she is, and helping to create easier paths to purchase. And a good e-commerce strategy can help a winery be maybe a little bit more agnostic about whichever channel the consumer chooses. And clearly, this is a bit of a big topic to unpack. But I wanted to look at a few examples and see how we see beverage companies exploring e-commerce opportunities across different channels. Back up one, there we go, time to split. So think about, changes in the on-premise, right? What we've seen over the last few months is really an acceleration of trends. Much of the growth in the on-premise channel is being driven by takeout and delivery, and a lot of that is being generated by online platforms, Grubhub, Uber Eats, DoorDash, and the like, right? These guys are playing a key role in driving e-commerce for the on-premise. And really a creative e-commerce strategy is looking for ways to tap into this opportunity, but maybe requires us to rethink and adjust our product offering and packaging offerings. And you think about kind of in that takeaway, the takeout, the traditional, the conventional buy the glass programs don't necessarily work very well for delivery, but the traditional 750 milliliter bottle doesn't work well here either. And maybe half bottles and other small formats. We've heard from this is what we hear some of the wineries exploring is maybe these things work better in this context. And we've been saying for years that the industry urgently needs to rethink its packaging options to better meet consumer needs. And I think the rise of Grubhub and Uber Eats and the like is only going to make this more compelling. And would just add to that, for what it's worth, we've even heard in some markets that the half bottles are doing really well, even in traditional sit-down dining, just as consumers are kind of avoiding draft beer and single-serve wines or wines by the glass due to contagion fears. So maybe jump to the next slide. So that's kind of on-premise. Think about, the other thing is, we know that consumers are going out less. One of the big opportunities for wineries is looking for ways to help the consumer recreate the on-premise experience at home. And we came across a really interesting example of this. Signature Brew in the UK, in the UK, came up with a really creative solution. They offered this thing called a pub in a box, where consumers could, buy what they call a pub in a box, and they'd ship them a case of beer, glassware, a music quiz, chips, an exclusive playlist that you could play on Spotify. And it was all really so the consumer could effectively recreate the pub experience in their living room. And maybe shipping a bag of chips with a $60 or $70 bottle of wine isn't necessarily what's appropriate for wineries in Sonoma or Napa, but it points to a creative way of thinking, I think, about using e-commerce to meet a changing consumer need and to build direct to consumer sales. Maybe jump to the next slide. But even for sales going through more traditional channels, we're on the thinking beyond traditional DTC. Even through more traditional channels, we're starting to see some really interesting e-commerce models emerge. In China, where beer sales tend to skew very heavily to the on-trade, sales were absolutely getting hammered during the COVID crisis. And one of the big brewers, looking around for solutions, started looking for creative ways to solve this via e-commerce. And they came up with what they called a Be a Distributor campaign that they launched on WeChat. And the idea was enlist consumers to promote their brands on social media. So these kind of what they called distributors would promote the Qingdao brand with their friends on social media, give them coupons to buy the beer. And the coupons were kind of, unique to each distributor or what they, promoter, with its own QR code. And the coupons could then be used at stores and other locations where, the buyer would get maybe a little bit of a discount and the distributor would get a commission, right? And it was really kind of an interesting success story. Qingdao had kind of hoped to sign up about 10,000 distributors over the course of a month. They signed up 40,000 in less than a week. In about 3 days, they had 40,000 people. And you think of it, a lot of people kind of sitting at home looking, they've lost work. This is a really interesting way to kind of solve that problem. And in a lot of ways, you could say, okay, this is just another social media influencer campaign, but it's one that kind of allows the brand owner to compensate specific promoters for specific sales. And it's kind of interesting. My colleague in Asia that brought me this example, he and I were talking about it, and he made an interesting comment. If you could jump to the next slide there, Damien. He said, maybe in some ways, e-commerce is allowing us to simply update and improve an older and established direct selling model, right? And he said, well, maybe the Avon lady is the future of wine e-commerce. And it really is, it's just, I think, thinking about this creatively and coming up with new solutions to solve problems for where the consumer is today. And maybe the last example, Damien, if we could jump to the next slide. The last example is, I would say, one of the things that is really interesting in today's context is the number of new platforms that are emerging where consumers can engage with brands, right? We spend a lot of time internally talking about online communities. And a really interesting example is Peloton. Peloton was essentially a company that focused on making fitness equipment, but it's created an extremely active and loyal online community of members that interact with each other during workouts, but then increasingly outside of workouts on a wide range of other lifestyle issues, including wine. And this is a very tight-knit and loyal community. And as part of this, you know, one of those discussions that they've kind of taken offline is wine. And if you go online on Facebook, there's actually a page of Peloton owners dedicated to wine discussions. And it's appropriately named Pelo Winos, and it's over 8,500 strong. And if you look at, you know, some of the comments, the things that they're sharing, really interesting. The members are constantly asking each other questions about wine, sharing preferences, making recommendations, and apparently even facilitating orders, right? I love this, you know, one lady saying, you know, I've got 4 wines, what do you guys recommend? Or this other one, a woman saying, oh gosh, you know, I have to say I've only been on this page for a month now, and you bitches make it impossible to pass up on all the good products and are costing me a fortune. You got to love that. If you're in the wine industry, you got to love hearing that. So, you know, to me, it's interesting. Maybe you're already finding ways to promote on pages like this or in these kinds of communities, but it strikes me as a really fascinating opportunity to engage these communities and to get trusted gatekeepers engaging and promoting our brands in tight-knit communities.